Chapter 35, Section 1, continued. Let's talk about Reagan and the Cold War. Reagan was very much anti-communist, even to the point that he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. So under Reagan, between 1981 and 1985, the Pentagon's budget, the Pentagon's responsible for the military, the Pentagon's budget is going to go from $150 billion a year to $250 billion. And most of that money is going to be spent on nuclear weapons. And people in the U.S. were starting to fear a nuclear war a little bit. I mean, we're building up our nukes, the Soviets are building up their nukes. They're becoming more and more technologically capable. And so Reagan proposes in 1983 something called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And what it was designed to do was to protect us. If the Soviets were to launch nukes at us, this would be a space-based missile defense system where we could shoot down any nuke that the Soviets were to launch at us. And now, the critics of this plan referred to it as Star Wars. You know, you're talking the era when Star Wars had first come out, and they call it Star Wars. And the critics say it's untestable, it's unworkable, and all it's going to do is intensify the arms race. They'll look for ways to get around it. They'll create their own system, whatever. And Reagan comes out simply and says, listen, it's a weapon of peace. It's designed to kill weapons, not people. Now, over time, one of the big things we're going to find out with this is it was too expensive. I mean, to create this thing would have just wrecked us economically. So we're dealing with some of our own issues, and the Soviet Union was dealing with some of their own issues. In 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. Okay? We know how that works out now, as we've done the same thing in the past. The Soviet Union's also going to be having problems in Poland. The workers in Poland want to have their own unions. And so Poland is going to allow its workers to form Solidarity, an independent trade union. The workers form this union, and then Poland changes its mind, declares martial law, closes down Solidarity, and has the leaders arrested. Now, there's obviously going to be an outrage in Poland over this, and the Soviets were ready to step in and just crush all of this resistance. Reagan warned the Soviets, stay out of it, let Poland deal with their own issues, and the Soviet Union listened. They weren't going to risk World War III over Poland. Other issues that the Soviets were having, in 1983, Soviet Union is going to shoot down a Korean commercial airplane. It was flying from Anchorage to Seoul, South Korea. It veered off of its flight path, took more of a direct route, but it took it over Soviet airspace. And the Soviet Union shoots it down, killing all 269 people on board, many of which were Americans. And the Soviet Union would come out and say the plane was actually spying on them, and that's why it shot it down. It wasn't. Later on in 83, the Soviet Union is mad because we're going to put nuclear missiles in Great Britain and Germany. And this is going to tick off the Soviet Union, who then walks out of arms control talks that we were in the process of having. It also led them to boycotting the 1984 Olympics because they were being held in Los Angeles. So in the early 80s here, the relationship between us and the Soviet Union was at its lowest point that it had been in years. Let's take a look at Latin America, because Reagan is going to increase our involvement in Latin America. Because the fear was if we did not step in with our influence in some of these developing nations, the Soviet Union would. And so we're going to look a lot at the countries of El Salvador and Nicaragua here. Let's start with El Salvador. In El Salvador, in 1979, they're going to get a new government, a brutal government. I mean, we're talking torturing their people, using death squads, brutal new government. So there ends up being a civil war in El Salvador. In 1984, José Napoleon Duarte is going to promise reform in El Salvador and that the civil war will end. And Reagan supports Duarte. Because again, if the rebels won, the rebels might be influenced by the Soviets. We can't have that. We're going to give military and economic aid to El Salvador, to Duarte, to make sure the rebels don't win. By the way, that civil war in El Salvador continued until 1992. It did not end right away. Let's take a look at Nicaragua. Okay, not very far from El Salvador. 1979, rebels are going to overthrow the dictator in Nicaragua. The rebels were called the Sandinistas. When the rebels overthrow the dictator, when the Sandinistas take over, Reagan is going to cut aid to Nicaragua because he says the Sandinistas were backed by the Soviet Union. And the Sandinistas were sending weapons to El Salvador, helping the rebels there. So the Sandinistas are turning to communist countries for assistance. The side we support were the Contras. The Contras are going to get CIA training, they're going to be armed by the CIA, and they're going to be financed by the CIA. When this starts to occur, you're going to have people in the U.S. looking at this and going, oh crap, here we go again, another Vietnam. Congress does not want to see that. Congress is going to start passing some laws banning us from fighting against the Sandinistas, and they passed the Boland Amendment saying we cannot provide aid to the Contras. We're not getting drug into another Vietnam here. So what the government does is they secretly keep supporting the Contras.